470 aircraft lost. That was the butcher's bill for the Allies in just the first 3 months of the Pacific War. The pilots faced horrors that went far beyond enemy fire. But what actually killed them? It wasn't just the skill of the Japanese aviators. It was a total technological mismatch. August 1940. The Japanese A6M0 appears in the skies over China. It engages Soviet-made fighters. The result is a massacre. The Soviet planes burn and fall. There is no contest. But the United States military ignored the warning signs. Intelligence reports arrived in Washington, describing a new, terrifyingly agile fighter. American officers dismissed them. They read the files and threw them in the trash. They blamed the losses on Chinese incompetence or outdated equipment. Arrogance blinded them. They refused to believe Japan could build a world-class machine. This mistake was paid for in blood. December 7, 1941, Pearl Harbor. The American pilots ran to their planes. The smell of burning oil filled the air. They took off and realized the truth immediately. Their machines were heavy and slow. The enemy was everywhere. At first glance, a fair dogfight, but in reality, an execution. The Japanese quickly established total air superiority. From the Philippines to the Solomon Islands, the sky belonged to the Zero. Why was this machine so deadly? One word: maneuverability. Mitsubishi engineers were obsessed with weight. They stripped everything non-essential. They drilled holes in the frame to save grams. The result was a fighter lighter than anything in the US inventory. It could turn on a dime. It could climb vertically while American planes stalled. And it had teeth. 2 20mm cannons and 2 7.7mm machine guns. A short burst tore through metal. The footage shows tracers ripping into Allied fuselages. Wings snap off. Planes spiral into the ocean. But this speed came with a fatal flaw. The Zero was fragile. It had no armor plating for the pilot. It lacked self-sealing fuel tanks. A single incendiary bullet could turn the cockpit into an inferno. The structure was paper-thin. Pilots joked that you could dent the fuselage just by gripping it too hard while climbing in. Japanese designers accepted this. They believed speed was the only armor they needed. For a long time, they were right. The United States Navy relied on the F4F Wildcat. It was rugged and tough. But in a one-on-one duel, it was a flying coffin. It couldn't turn with the Zero. It couldn't run away. Even after the victory at the Battle of Midway, the mood was grim. Pilots returned to carriers shaking with adrenaline and rage. They complained to their superiors. The machines were not good enough. Commander John Thatch wrote a brutal after-action report. He didn't mince words. He called the Wildcat pitifully inferior in climb, maneuverability, and speed. These words came from a hero of Midway. The brass had to listen. But Thatch did more than complain. He analyzed the geometry of death. He developed a counter-tactic, the Thatch weave. American pilots stopped flying alone. They flew in pairs. The diagram shows the move clearly. 2 Wildcats weave in a crisscross pattern. When a Zero latched onto the tail of one fighter, the American pilot turned. His wingman turned toward him. The pursuing Zero flew directly into the wingman's guns. It was a trap. It required discipline and nerves of steel, but it worked. It allowed the slow Wildcats to survive against a superior enemy. The slaughter slowed down. Yet everyone understood the reality. Tactics were a temporary fix. The Thatch weave bought time, but it could not win the war. The Navy needed a new machine. They needed a monster that could hunt the Zero. The era of the Wildcat was ending. Time was running out. Grumman had actually started work on the Hellcat design back in 1938. But started is a deceptive word. The production line stood still until October 1942. 4 years of silence. Originally, the aircraft was intended as a modest upgrade over the Wildcat. Nothing revolutionary, just a tweak here and there. However, war has a way of speeding things up. The F6F prototype roared into the sky in late June 1942. This was exactly 22 days after Thatch filed his damning report about the Wildcat's failures. The paper trail was clear. The old planes were dying. Grumman engineers didn't just read the reports, they absorbed the panic from the front lines. They incorporated every bloody lesson learned from actual combat against the Japanese. But this was only the beginning. About 2 weeks after the Hellcat's first flight, luck intervened. American forces recovered a crashed Japanese Zero in the Aleutian Islands. The terrain was unforgiving, soft mud, fog. The plane had flipped over upon landing. The pilot's neck snapped instantly. But the aircraft itself? It wasn't badly damaged. This was absolute gold for Allied intelligence. They didn't just look at it. They picked it up, cleaned the mud from the cylinders, and repaired it. Then, they tortured it. Test pilots flew it in every possible way to figure out how to kill it. What they discovered changed the war. At first glance, a nimble predator, but in reality, a fragile kite. The Zero's structure was weak. The manual flight controls were primitive. At high speeds, the aircraft started shaking violently. The airframe threatened to break itself apart if the speed increased. The controls became incredibly heavy. They could actually lock up at those speeds because they weren't hydraulically assisted. On top of that, American engineers identified another flaw. The Zero performed poorly at higher altitudes. The thinner air strangled its engine performance. All of this influenced the final design of the Hellcat. But Grumman also made a crucial decision. It wasn't about raw numbers, it was about logistics. Why did they limit the performance? They could have built a racing machine. But war demanded a lot of pilots. Training them wasn't fast or cheap. Experienced aviators were difficult to replace when they were lost in combat. So, instead of squeezing every last bit of performance out of the Hellcat, engineers compromised. They sacrificed a bit of speed and climb rate. In exchange, they demanded reliability, simplified production, and ease of flying. This decision would prove incredibly important. It would play a huge part in winning the war in the Pacific. They finally decided to put the monster Pratt & Whitney double Wasp engine into the Hellcat. It pushed out 2,000 horsepower. The sound was a physical force. This gave it about 60 miles per hour greater top speed than the Zero. It also provided a better rate of climb. Now, the Zero's turn capability at low speeds was legendary. It would never be matched by any fighter in the Second World War. The Hellcat wasn't even going to try. American pilots would soon learn a new doctrine. Do not play to the Zero's strengths. Instead, use the advantages in speed and dive performance. Dictate the terms of every fight. The footage shows a Hellcat dives, fires, and vanishes before the enemy can turn. The Hellcat carried 212 pounds of armor positioned around the cockpit. If you remember, the Zero had none at all. The windshield was bullet-resistant. Later variants improved cockpit visibility by replacing the plexiglass windscreen with a flat armored glass panel. For armament, it had 6 Browning .50 caliber machine guns. For the time, this was serious firepower. It was more than enough to tear apart the fragile Zero. The kinetic energy sawed wings off. Self-sealing fuel tanks significantly reduced the risk of fire or explosions when the aircraft took hits. This was again something Zero pilots could only dream about. The Hellcat also had the largest wings of any single-engine fighter in the Second World War. This gave it a lower stall speed. It made the machine much easier to handle. This was especially important for carrier operations. Young pilots had to land on a moving deck in rain, wind, and smoke. Compare this to the Corsair. The Corsair was actually a bit faster than the Hellcat, but it earned a dark nickname, Ensign Eliminator. It killed too many rookies during carrier landing attempts. The Hellcat, by contrast, was far more forgiving. Its wings used Grumman's stow-wing folding arrangement. This allowed many aircraft to be packed onto a carrier's deck and hangar. In short, the whole aircraft was designed to be simple, easy to build, easy to maintain. The handling characteristics were exceptional for a fighter of this era. The Hellcat had that low stall speed we mentioned. It gave plenty of warning during an accelerated stall. It offered an easy recovery if things went wrong. Even if a pilot accidentally put the plane into a spin, recovery was straightforward and fast. All of this meant one thing: Hellcat pilots could push their aircraft right to the edge of its performance envelope. Pilots of other fighters might not dare to do so. And there was one more critical advantage that the Hellcat had over the Zero: the supercharging system. It gave the engine much more power at higher altitudes. This was exactly where the Zero struggled. So, American pilots could climb above their opponents. They watched from above. They dove down with superior speed. They took their shots. And then they zoomed back up to altitude where the Zero simply couldn't follow effectively. The stage was now set. The Americans had a new fighter. It was finally better than the aircraft that had been slaughtering them for the past year. But having a good aircraft was only part of the solution. What mattered now was the human element. The question was, what happened when young American pilots actually took Hellcats into combat? And what it would cost them to turn the tide of the air war in the Pacific. January 1943. The first F6F Hellcats rolled off the assembly line and into the hands of Navy pilots. They arrived exactly when the American fleet needed them most. However, the planes would spend months in training. They didn't see a single enemy fighter until October 5, 1943. The location, Wake Island. The event, the first real test between the Zero and the Hellcat. It was a massacre. 48 Hellcats ambushed 23 Japanese fighters. The result was 16 Zeros destroyed. The Americans lost 0 aircraft. Why was this result so significant? It happened below 12,000 feet. This altitude was the Zero's home turf. It was the specific height where the Japanese fighter performed at its absolute peak. Even with the advantage of low altitude, the A6M was outclassed. The era of Japanese dominance in the Pacific air ended that morning. But the Navy stayed cautious. Flight instructors issued a specific warning: do not get overconfident. Pilots were told never to engage in a low-speed turning duel. In close quarters, the Zero still turned tighter. In the hands of a veteran, the obsolete Japanese plane remained a killer. The footage shows the difference at high speed. Above 275 miles per hour, the Zero's manual controls became heavy. The pilot had to fight the stick. Above 300 miles per hour, the plane became nearly impossible to maneuver. At these speeds, the Hellcat was actually the more agile aircraft. How did the Americans exploit this? They refused to slow down. A Hellcat pilot watched his airspeed indicator constantly. If the speed dropped below 200 miles per hour, he exited the fight immediately. He used his superior engine power to dive or zoom away. The Zero had no counter. If the Japanese pilot followed, a second Hellcat usually sat waiting above to pick him off. If he stayed behind, the first Hellcat simply gained distance, turned, and came back for another high-speed firing pass. The Japanese trick of climbing away to safety no longer worked. The Hellcat followed them up and shot them down. Japan's industry was failing. They had new designs on the drawing board, but no factories to build them. They had no choice but to keep the Zero in the air. Mitsubishi added better engines. They increased the muzzle velocity of the 20mm cannons. They tried to give their pilots a fighting chance. It didn't work. The Zero was a kite. It lacked armor plate and self-sealing fuel tanks. One short burst from the Hellcat's 650 caliber machine guns turned the Zero into a torch. The planes didn't just fail, they disintegrated in mid-air. In contrast, the Hellcat was a tank with wings. The sound of heavy bullets hitting the fuselage was common, but the plane kept flying. It could absorb hundreds of rounds and still land on a carrier deck. Even in a crash, the rugged frame protected the man inside. For the Japanese pilot, any hit was a death sentence. The psychological impact was immediate. Japanese pilots recorded their frustration. They would get behind a Hellcat, fire everything they had, and watch the American plane simply fly away. The predator had become the prey. This was the turning point. 2,460 aircraft. That is the total number of Hellcats lost during the entire war. The F6F Hellcat was a dominant predator in the sky, a machine built to secure air superiority. But the statistics reveal a cold, hard truth about where the pilots actually died. When analysts broke down the numbers, the results were shocking. Only 270 planes were lost in direct aerial combat against enemy fighters. Anti-aircraft fire from ships and ground positions claimed another 550. Operational failures took 340 more. But where did the rest go? The majority of the losses did not happen in the crosshairs of a Japanese Zero. 1,300 Hellcats were destroyed along with their pilots in training and ferry operations. They crashed thousands of miles from the front lines. That is more than half of all losses, 53%. The enemy was not the Japanese Imperial Navy. The enemy was the training process itself. Why was the death rate so high? It was a single-seat fighter. There was no instructor in the back to grab the stick if a rookie panicked. A new pilot had to learn to land on a moving deck alone. He had to catch a steel wire while moving at 100 miles an hour, with the ship pitching in the waves. Mistakes were fatal. The ocean swallowed hundreds of men before they ever saw a combat zone. But for those who survived the training, the danger simply changed shape. Strafing runs were exceptionally deadly. The Hellcat had heavy armor, but it was not invincible. Pilots had to dive straight toward Japanese airfields or shipping. They held their aim steady. They pressed the trigger. But then came the pullout. At extremely low altitude, the aircraft was vulnerable to every weapon on the ground. Rifles, machine guns, flak cannons. The pilot had to climb away through a literal curtain of lead aimed directly at his cockpit. Life on the carrier offered no escape from the stress. Quarters below deck were cramped, smelling of oil and sweat. Pilots slept in shifts, always ready to scramble. Outside, the lifeguard destroyers trailed behind the carrier fleet. Their specific job was to fish pilots out of the water when takeoffs or landings failed. And they failed often. Landing on a carrier in the 1940s was an act of controlled violence. There were no angled flight decks, there were no computers. A pilot relied entirely on the landing signal officer. This man stood at the very edge of the deck, fighting the wind, using colored paddles to guide the plane in. If the pilot missed the wire, there was no second chance. There was no runway left to accelerate and take off again. At first glance, a routine landing. But in reality, a choice between a crash barrier and the ocean. If the hook missed, the plane slammed into the parked aircraft at the front of the deck, or it skidded over the side and vanished into the churning water. Now imagine doing this in total darkness. Night landings were the single most terrifying task for a World War II aviator. Pilots admitted they feared the dark deck more than they feared the Japanese. Mechanical failures added to the body count. Early Hellcat models had issues with tires. They were either poor quality or simply could not withstand the abuse of a carrier landing. A pilot would come in too hard, exhausted from a 4-hour mission. The tire would blow. The aircraft would spin uncontrollably across the steel plates. It was not rare for the machine to flip and crush the man inside. The footage confirms the brutality of these accidents. Consider the legendary incident on the USS Enterprise. The camera captures Ensign Byron Milton Johnson attempting an emergency landing. His engine is failing. He hits the deck hard. The hook catches the wire, but the force is too great. The port landing gear collapses into the catwalk at the edge of the ship. The Hellcat slams onto its belly tank. Fuel immediately begins to spray across the deck. The propeller is still spinning. The metal blades strike the steel edge of the ship. Sparks fly. The fuel ignites instantly. Johnson is trapped. The impact has jammed the canopy rails. He cannot slide the glass back. He is sitting inside a burning bomb. In the frame, Lieutenant Walter Lewis Tuning runs toward the fire. He does not hesitate. He steps directly onto the burning fuel tank. He reaches into the flames, forces the cockpit open, and pulls Johnson out. The heat is intense. The danger of explosion is immediate. This single event changed naval protocol forever. The famous ace Butch O'Hare reviewed the report and issued a new recommendation. Pilots were ordered to drop their external fuel tanks before landing. It was the only way to prevent the deck from turning into an inferno. But fire was not the only way to die. Going over the side of the carrier was a nightmare scenario. The ship itself was a massive steel mountain moving at 30 knots. If you fell into the water near the bow, the hull would run you over. If you fell near the stern, The massive propellers and the wake would suck you under. And the Hellcat was not built to float. If a pilot ran out of fuel over open water, he had a terrible choice. He could bail out or try to ditch the plane. Ditching a fighter was notoriously lethal. The heavy engine in the nose and the low air intake meant the physics were against him. The video evidence shows the plane hits the water and instantly flips forward. The airframe often broke apart on impact. The pilot would be crushed or drowned in seconds. Because of this, almost everyone chose the parachute. It was better to trust the silk than to trust the water. By late 1944, the stakes rose again. A new threat emerged from the horizon. The Japanese adopted kamikaze tactics on an industrial scale. The Hellcat pilots became the fleet's primary shield. Their mission changed. They had to intercept the suicide planes and destroy them completely before they reached the American ships. There was no margin for error. A damaged kamikaze could still crash into a flight deck. The sirens never seemed to stop. There was no safe zone, no rest. The war had evolved into a desperate struggle for survival, where a pilot could die from a bullet, a broken wire, or a simple mistake in the dark. Thus ended the illusion of safety. The F6F Hellcat earned its title as the Zero Killer. The combat data proved it. Against Japan's top-tier fighter, the Hellcat maintained a kill ratio of 13-1. Some records suggest the number was as high as 19-1. This made it the most effective fighter of the entire conflict. 2,000 aircraft, that was the gap. Carrier-based Navy Hellcats shot down more Japanese planes than the P-38 Lightning and the F-4U Corsair combined. This tally includes every Corsair variant, whether flying from dirt strips or flight decks. By June 1944, the Hellcat controlled the Pacific. But the ultimate test was still ahead. The Battle of the Philippine Sea remains the largest carrier engagement in history. For the Japanese, it was a slaughter. June 19, 1944. In 24 hours, the Imperial Japanese Navy lost 275 aircraft. Hellcat pilots claimed almost all of them. The Americans lost 15 planes in air-to-air combat that day. The ratio was so lopsided that pilots coined a nickname for the massacre: the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The sound of radio chatter was filled with American pilots calling out targets like they were at a range. Why was the Hellcat so dominant? At first glance, it was the apex of technology. But in reality, it wasn't the fastest or the most agile. The Corsair was actually the superior machine on paper. It had a higher top speed, a faster rate of climb, and a quicker roll rate. The Hellcat could dive faster and turn tighter in a dogfight, but in terms of raw statistics, the Corsair held the edge. There was a different reason for the Hellcat's success. It was easy to build and even easier to fly. These two traits were more valuable than top speed. In the cockpit, the pilot felt a heavy, stable machine. In the factory, workers saw a design meant for mass production. Grumman's Bethpage plant was a machine. For 24 months, the factory rolled out over 500 Hellcats every 30 days. 12,275 aircraft in total. Every single one came from one factory. No other fighter in the war matched this production density. This allowed the United States to absorb losses instantly. If a Hellcat went down in the morning, a replacement was on the deck by evening. Operations expanded while the Japanese entered a death spiral. The Zero could no longer compete. The Japanese had newer, faster prototypes on paper, but the factories were empty. Industrial shortages meant these planes never reached the front lines in volume. The footage shows Japanese airfields are littered with damaged airframes and green pilots. Experienced veterans were dying faster than the flight schools could produce them. New recruits arrived at the front with minimal flight hours. Quality control vanished. Engines failed. Airframes vibrated. The machines no longer met their own specifications. Before Pearl Harbor, Japan focused on quality over quantity. The Imperial Navy started the war with 3,000 elite pilots. Over the next 2 years, they added only 5,000 more. In that same window, The U.S. Navy alone trained 17,000 pilots. This does not even count the Army Air Forces. The gap widened through 1942 and 43. During the Solomon Islands campaign, attrition was nearly equal. But the Americans had a deep reservoir of trained men. Japan had a shallow pool that was drying up. Management made the difference. The U.S. Navy rotated its pilots out. After a tour, a pilot went home to rest and train the next generation. The Japanese stayed until they died. Units remained in the meat grinder until they were wiped out or the pilots collapsed from exhaustion. It was a vicious cycle. Stressed pilots became careless. They missed visual cues. They reacted slowly to the sound of tracers passing their cockpits. Their situational awareness evaporated. By 1944, the difference was undeniable. A new U.S. Navy pilot arrived with 500 hours of flight time. His Japanese opponent was lucky to have 300. Often, it was much less. It showed in every banking turn and every burst of gunfire. Japan turned to suicide tactics out of pure desperation. Kamikaze strikes became the only way to reliably strike a hull. Conventional dogfighting was a dead end. By the end of the war, the Hellcat was aging. Newer designs were catching up. If the war had lasted another year, the Hellcat might have been outclassed. But the war was already decided. The air war in the Pacific was won by the Grumman factory. A successor, the F6F Bearcat, was already sitting on the tarmac. It was faster, lighter, and deadlier. But the Bearcat never saw combat. The Hellcat had already finished the job. Thus ended the era of the Zero Killer.